If you go on the chatbot Claude today and you click to use its latest generation AI model available to the public, it's called Fable 5. It now says currently unavailable. You can't subscribe to it. This is just days after being launched. It's been disabled by Anthropic, the tech giant behind it, because the US ordered it to suspend access to all foreign nationals on national security grounds. They didn't give specific details. So Anthropic has, quote, abruptly suspended access to both models. Insiders at the company say the government believes that a method of bypassing or jailbreaking the safeguard put in place by Anthropic and means if you know how, the few people that can, you could use the model to exploit vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Now, for much of the year, the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, has pointed out the existential risks, he says, of superhuman AI. And he was asked about this 3 weeks ago by Oprah Winfrey. The question was this: you've said there was a meaningful chance technology could cause human extinction, but you're racing to build it faster. How do you justify it when the rest of us don't get a vote? This is what he said.
I said, well, I don't know. I think the Industrial Revolution could lead to very powerful weapons and kill a bunch of people. That's definitely true, right? In some cases, it did do that.
It did do it.
But we understand that the Industrial Revolution as a process, as a technological event, was worth doing. We don't still want to be living in caves.
Let's bring in Aisha Down, the Guardian's AI correspondent. Welcome to France 24, Aisha. Great to have you with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with this US directive. What's your take and why it's come now?
So I think it's important to say that neither actor here is entirely as they appear. So on the one hand, you have the Trump administration. They aren't historically very, very pro AI safety. They tend to be sort of more AI accelerationists, although there's nuance here. And so I don't think you can read this directive simply on its surface, especially if you remember kind of the year ago, the dust up that Trump had with NVIDIA, which, began with Trump restricting, access or restricting NVIDIA's ability to export a certain chip, the H20, over, again, national security concerns, and then walking back on that and cutting a deal that was really actually, good for him in a way that weirdly gave the U.S. a cut of NVIDIA's exports. Similarly here, there's been, a series of dust-ups between Anthropic and first the Department of Defense. Now this is supposed to come from the Commerce Department. The question is, of course, or you have to ask, is this real fair? How real is this jailbreak? Or is Trump trying to make a kind of deal? I think one more thing to look at there are sort of rumors reported, I think a week or two ago, that the administration is also considering taking equity stakes in AI companies. So there are things on the table here that we may not be aware of.
This is a very interesting point. So essentially, that as you talk about and see it, this could be leverage potentially for President Trump here, that there's been conflict between the company and the Trump administration, particularly over its use within the Pentagon and the military. Mm-hmm. And Dario, the CEO, saying about it's basically putting down markers of where the restrictions are. This could be a way outside of the jailbreak to kind of use this leverage point now.
I think so. And I would like to say, I think there are a lot of smoke and mirrors as to what the end goal could be and what could be on the table. I go back to, again, it was OpenAI who sort of reportedly is in talks with the government taking an equity stake in AI companies. But they could be looking at that for other companies as well, we imagine. An interesting thing about that is that it was sort of reported that tech companies don't want that. But I think if you look at the long kind of history of the writings of Anthropic and OpenAI, I'd say they both sometimes kind of seem to desire government partnership or government power, and then sometimes also don't. Very famously, I think in Sam Altman's disclosed emails, there's talk of a Manhattan project for AI. The scenario AI 2027 sort of fantasizes about, the government merging with a great big powerful AI company to control this powerful technology. And so there's an ambivalence here in both the narrative of these companies and what they think they want, and then the actions and what's sort of being briefed behind the scenes.
That is very interesting. It's also worth just tell us a bit more, because aside from the leverage point, like you say, the smoke and mirrors, on the issue of the jailbreak itself, there's a researcher, isn't there? This particular case appears to be somebody who's known online as Pliny or Pliny the Liberator. This seems to be a specific case.
I don't actually know about that, which jailbreak it was. I think if we go back to Mythos, which is sort of the predecessor, the larger concern is that Mythos was able to find vulnerabilities in a wide variety of software systems. And Anthropic kind of named banks. They named I think a legacy old operating system that it's not really that much in use. And the vulnerabilities were called zero-day exploits, which means their developers didn't know about them. And based on this evidence, it said Mythos was too powerful to release. And Fable is a version of that's okay to release. Most people who commented on it at the time and looked at sort of what Mythos was able to do said that, its capabilities were considerable, but they were basically kind of where the frontier already was. And so Anthropic, while I think correctly identifying that the model was powerful and could, enable hacks, basically was sort of making a story about AI development, wider story about AI development into a story about their product, which was very good for them.
Now, I noticed one thing, there's the podcast All In that many tech goers and researchers and those interested go to. This is by David Sachs, one of the so-called PayPal mafia and President Trump's former crypto and AI czar. He was discussing this issue today with David Friedberg, another tech entrepreneur, and talking about one of the implications. I'd like your take on this. Their thoughts about restrictions generally on Anthropic and others is what happens next for users. This is what they said.
As folks like Anthropic say, hey, we're going to restrict access or censor the output of these models, it is going to force companies like ourselves who still want to take advantage of the capability of these LLMs to go and get open source tools and run them. And what are the best open source models today? They're Chinese.
Yeah, they are.
And that is a major concern. The American open source models are not as good as the Chinese open source models. So the restrictions that Anthropic and others are putting upon themselves and upon the industry is forcing a lot of companies to go and get open source Chinese models and run them. We're seeing this across the landscape with startups,
we see it
with large scale enterprises. Everyone's making that move.
What do you make of that, Aisha? Have they got a point?
Certainly not something I've heard of a lot of tech companies we talk to, rushing to DeepSeek. Of course, open source models are important, but people can also build and have built on Llama as well. So there's clearly like an element of security theater going on here. But of course, that's what the chat is going to be. It's all going to be about kind of the AI race between the US and China. Most startups who are kind of adopting or piloting AI use, I don't know, need cutting edge open source or Anthropic or OpenAI produced models. The challenge to adoption is different than that, and I'd say a lot more nuanced. But it's an interesting take.
I also want to mention something that was touched upon there briefly, which is the Anthropic model itself. I don't know how much time you had to look at the latest model that was briefly available. But within this model itself, and this is common to some, I think to some extent with OpenAI, but not to Grok. And this is if you're using chatbots and the wider rollout of Claude, the latest model on Fable 5, there's a data retention within it. So I think 30 days has been a concern to some. And that is basically security about who could get access to it, to malware, things like that, or copying the systems. But is there also a concern about what becomes of your data, that you can have kind of a two-tier profile?
I think I understood that Microsoft was sort of actually telling its employees to move back to Copilot. And I think some of the concerns around Fable came around the questions around recursive self-improvement. So the idea that sort of shortly before it was released, it came out, I believe Anthropic, with sort of an essay about how Claude, and I think partly Fable related, had gotten much better at kind of writing its own code. And so, these led, I would say, to a lot of the guardrails around Fable. There was a backlash to Fable before its release, and I believe that backlash was actually sort of, I guess I'm not quite sure what we mean by data retention here, but the backlash, as I understood it, was that it couldn't be used to help users code their own stuff. There were like restrictions on how Fable could be applied, and that while it came off, or while Anthropic framed it as a safety intervention, people actually thought that it was sort of anti-competitive, and Anthropic was just trying to make sure that it had sort of control of the frontier and control of its product ahead of the IPO.
That's a very good point. Essentially, just to stop the building of rival AI systems potentially, or competition. Yeah. And to that point, I asked Claude a similar question. I'll put it to you what I asked and what I got back. So I said to Claude today, can you look into whether Anthropic's model can build a profile on you to classify you, to determine the product it unlocks for you? For example, if Anthropic decides you're not worthy of having access to that level of information, can it create a level of AI haves and have-nots? And this is what it says. You can see here, it says, yes, real-time classifiers are actively profiling your prompts. They are looking to detect policy violations in real time. It talks about the due diligence process. There is a tiered access system on trustworthiness, the beneficial nature of the use case, and it goes on to say that basically, if you're using their chatbot, the overall trustworthiness and beneficial nature of their use case. In other words, they judge you and unlock accordingly. As you can see here, here's where it gets really serious, says Claude. A secret sabotage story to which you touched upon. Anthropic quietly builds guardrails into Fable 5 that degrades performance whether someone tried to use the model for building AI systems. And it goes on to say that's been criticised in the industry, anti-competition. The broader implication, it says, if Anthropic is willing to secretly limit Claude's capabilities for competitive reasons, what other hidden restrictions might exist? The lack of disclosure is particularly troubling. So says Claude, Aisha.
I think Anthropic would frame that all as AI safety language. So not like, in their telling, this would not be like special users get elite privileges. The non-special users don't get elite privileges. What they're saying is like AI is going to kill us all. And this recursive self-improvement thing that they just came out with, which, a lot of people say is hype ahead of the IPO, some of that must be true, is a drum they've been beating for a long time, that AI will learn to build more and more powerful AI, and then we'll lose control of it. And then it will, in one scenario, payload the earth with data centers and solar panels. And so that's the whole narrative. They would definitely not say we're giving two-tiered access to people. They may well be doing that. But what they'll frame it as is we're not going to, or what they did frame it as is, we would not let these sort of really advanced tools we've been developing be used to improve code. And why they might be saying that is because then someone else who's really bad will use it to, make a killer AI. But what they probably don't want is someone else to make a competing AI model that could, make trouble for them ahead of this IPO. I think, another thing you see is them calling for a temporary pause on AI development. It's doubtful to me that they would achieve that ahead of the IPO, but it seems another move where they're sort of looking at the field around them. They want to cement their leading position, and they'd also like to have special face time with policymakers, as they already have with Mythos, in order to, they've got in front of Scott Percent, they've got in front of MI5. It's great for their, potential share price. And I don't want to cynically say that's all of it, but that has to be part of it.
And to that point, I guess the elephant in the room we haven't mentioned, because there's many aspects to this, is Elon Musk. Because in all of this, and you said looking around the field of which the competition for AI, I think Anthropic were looking this week to test the waters to launch as a public company. 24 hours, this all happens. After, obviously, what happened with SpaceX launching as a public company, making Elon Musk a trillionaire.
It was really funny because someone who, a very brilliant person, Doug Mattery, who monitors the internet, actually pointed us out, I think a few weeks ago, that when the government sort of announced, when the US had that dust up, the Pentagon and Anthropic in March, there was a surge in Claude usage. There was because among their clients, they monitored various ISPs, right? And so people who had sort of been using GPT suddenly heard of Claude, and it just went like that. I mean, everyone was sort of briefly on Claude, and then it, I think it was a spike, and then afterwards it declined. So sometimes this stuff is great for Anthropic, and they are masters of narrative. They really are. You look at how many glowing profiles they've landed in the Wall Street Journal, and 2 podcasts, I think it was 2 New York Times podcasts, a New Yorker story, and so I don't know. This could be great for them ahead of their IPO. It's really hard to say, but I don't know that I can say it would be bad. They seem to be really good at spinning things.
Yes, just look at the figures. Claude, this is according to Bloomberg, sitting around 33 million monthly active users at the moment, seeing a huge spike, as you pointed to, of just people logging on for the first time, talking about millions of people a week in the past few weeks, but 33 million now standard. ChatGPT still way ahead, it's a different league, 900 million weekly active users, but it shows you the kind of the incremental steps it's making, and perhaps the bigger, wider picture. Aisha, it's been lovely talking to you. A brief thought on do you think this is how temporary is this suspension of the company? What do you see happening next for its Fable model?
Well, hard to say. It's hard to see it lasting. I guess would be. It's hard to see it lasting, and it seems to me to be concealing other moves. I mean, worth pointing out that even though the Pentagon declared Claude a supply chain risk in March, it was still used, and I think, as I understand, still is being used. Whatever might. I mean, this has been sort of a powerful move by Anthropic. It's got a lot of attention. But I would not expect it to be long lasting. I don't have anyone inside the Trump administration who's briefing me on this, so I can't say anymore. But that's just my.
Yes, a takeaway might be useful to think about is just not everything is always as it seems. I think that's what we'll take away from this. Aisha, great to talk to you. Aisha Down, The Guardian's AI correspondent.
Thanks very much.